Imagine fighting a war for 10 years, only to spend the next decade battling man-eating giants, sorceresses, and the gods themselves just to get back home. Welcome to the ultimate retelling of the Odyssey, the greatest adventure story ever told. Prepare to travel across the wine-dark ocean, facing tempests and sirens along with forgotten isles and deities of the past. We are exploring the complete saga of the Odyssey, a legend of yearning and staying alive, of curses and sharp wits, following a man who was desperate to return home. This tale dates back thousands of years, originally shared through spoken words beneath the night sky. For days, the city remained on fire. Thick black pillars of smoke rose up like bad omens toward a sky that didn't care, while the smell of burnt rock and life reached 100 leagues away from Ilium. Troy was once a majestic place, boasting high walls and golden towers that shined under the Anatolian sun. Its citadel was home to kings who had successfully held back 1,000 Greek ships for 10 bitter years. However, even the strongest stone cannot last forever, and no wall is high enough to block a lie when it is disguised as a gift. The famous wooden horse became their undoing, dragged inside the gates amidst singing and celebration. It sat silently in the center of the city, as empty as the vows that came with it. Hidden inside, 30 of the best warriors the Achaeans could find waited like snakes in a basket, keeping their swords ready and their breath held until darkness covered the city and the Trojans fell into a drunken sleep. That was when the slaughter started, and when the sun rose again, it shined not on Troy, but on its wreckage. Odysseus of Ithaca, the son of Laertes, walked through these ashes. He was famous across the islands for his brilliant intellect rather than just the strength of his arm. Even though the horse strategy had been his own idea, he hadn't cheered when it was pulled through the gates. He stayed silent as the palaces collapsed one by one, their marble pillars groaning like dying trees before smashing into the earth. He felt no happiness in what he witnessed. Moving through the debris like a ghost, his sandals crushed the remains of a civilization that had lasted longer than living memory. He looked upon bodies half buried in the rubble, seeing soldiers burned in their armor, women staring up at the sky, and children hiding in corners where even the gods would be afraid to look. They had achieved victory, certainly, but it arrived like a harsh winter following the harvest, stripping everything bare and leaving only the cold. The Trojans were erased, their city destroyed, and while the Greeks had won a legendary war, there was nothing left to fight for. The end of a war is a strange experience. It isn't a single moment where weapons are put away and peace settles instantly like a soft blanket. Instead, it is a slow and uneven process. It is a calming of the blood, a silencing of the screams, and a realization that the rage and pain that once felt so important are becoming distant memories. For Odysseus, this conflict had lasted far too long. When he first left Ithaca, he had dark hair on his shoulders and a young son holding onto his wife's leg, believing the gods would protect him. Now he was older, leaner, and hardened like iron in the fire. He had witnessed the finality of glory within that forge of war. While other monarchs prepared to sail home with songs of victory and ships laden with gold, Odysseus felt a distinct lack of fire within his chest. His mind was occupied solely by thoughts of Penelope, remembering her patient hands and quiet eyes, and of Telemachus, the infant he had left behind who might now be a fully grown man. Centuries later, archaeologists would excavate the soil of northwestern Turkey to discover the remains of Troy buried beneath ages of silence. These researchers would uncover scorched stones, crumbled walls, and arrowheads stuck in fallen gates, with layers of ash telling the tale as vividly as any poet. They would identify it as Troy Via, noting it aligned with Homer's timeline, proving a real city and likely a real war existed. However, right then, there were no historians to document the moment, only the dead and the victors. Among the living stood a weary king, with salt graying his temples and shadows darkening his heart, gazing out at the ocean. The breeze whispered softly, carrying the scent of fire and blood away from the coast, signaling it was time to leave. Odysseus assembled the survivors. Their vessels swayed in the shallows, timber groaning like exhausted beasts and black sails hanging limp. Boarding was a silent affair without cheers or songs, just the rhythmic sound of feet on wood and the creak of oars as they pushed into the open water. Smoldering Troy lay behind them while the vast, mysterious ocean stretched ahead like a dark promise. No soul knew what this journey would entail, Odysseus least of all. High atop Olympus, the gods watched from their thrones and started to whisper. Upon leaving the burning city, the sea remained calm, a silver and ash mirror still stained by the smoke trailing behind them. At first, the ships moved slowly, oars hitting the tide with a quiet, almost reverent rhythm. The decks held no laughter or jubilant anthems. The Greeks had anticipated the sweet taste of triumph, yet the ashes of Ilion coated their tongues instead. After 10 years of fighting and the final fall of Troy, they did not sail as returning conquerors, but as men hollowed out by sacrifice and time. The war had stolen their certainty, along with their youth and comrades. They faced the unknown rather than peace, for a decade of war leaves no man unchanged. Odysseus positioned himself at the prow of his black ship, wrapping one hand in his dark cloak and resting the other on the rail. He stared at the horizon, seeing only the shimmer where water met sky, while his mind drifted to Ithaca. He pictured the craggy island of his birth, with its goat-scattered hills, olive trees, the scent of salt and thyme, and the white palace stones where Penelope waited, assuming she still did. He imagined her weaving by lamplight on the terrace, her fingers skillful and tireless, though perhaps aged by now. Telemachus, the boy left in swaddling clothes, would be nearly a man. Would the son recognize the father, or had time wiped him away like a chalk mark on a stone? The crew rowed on, arms relying on the muscle memory of soldiers used to hardship. The only sounds were the soft water lapping and the oars creaking. Some men stared blankly at the ocean, while others whispered prayers or kissed small tokens worn around their necks, charms given by mothers, wives, or children left behind. Every man dreamed of home, yet none knew the route. The Aegean was unpredictable, and the gods even more so. Divine powers had already started quarreling, dividing up favors and punishments. The unity of the war effort dissolved into pride and suspicion. Agamemnon would return to Mycenae with a cursed woman and a haul of treasure, while Menelaus would wander far longer than the swift return his brother had promised. However, it was Odysseus who unknowingly attracted Poseidon's attention. Beneath the waves, the sea god watched, brooding like a suppressed storm. As the builder of traps and speaker of lies, Odysseus had played a role in Troy's destruction that no deity could overlook. While some gods despised his cunning and others admired it, Poseidon simply remembered. For a brief time, the god stayed his hand, allowing the ships to glide over gentle swells with favorable winds. Yet that peace was merely a pause, for the sea never remained still for long. Even the weather appeared hesitant, as if the earth itself was waiting to see the course the Greeks would choose. At night, stars wheeled in familiar constellations, yet their patterns seemed slightly shifted, as if the heavens had moved while men slaughtered each other on the Trojan shores. The winds were warm and soft as breath, but a darker, colder threat always lurked behind them. During those initial days, Odysseus spoke very little. He issued commands with quiet clarity, but his mind was elsewhere. He understood better than most that this voyage would be far from simple. Too many gods had taken sides, and too many eyes had watched Troy burn. Their road home would be carved by sorrow, will, and fate, not just by sails or oars. Although the men trusted him, some whispered correctly that the gods had marked him. They sailed past the islands and capes framing the Anatolian coast, slipping into deeper waters where the horizon expanded and currents became unfamiliar. Each morning presented a new sky and a fresh risk. No maps existed for what lay ahead, only old tales of islands that moved, winds that tore ships apart, and sirens who sang sailors to their deaths. The men used to laugh at such stories, but they weren't laughing anymore. Odysseus stood alone beneath the stars at night, listening to the wind, waiting for the next trial. The war had ended, but the journey was only starting. After leaving Troy, the sea grew restless, as if it too was weary of war. Tides turned against them and winds shifted without warning. One day the sails would swell, and the next they would fall slack, making the men uneasy and silent. When the black ships finally reached the coast of Thrace, the crew was hungry, tired, and losing the discipline that had held them together during the campaign. They encountered the city of Ismarus, a stronghold of the Cicons, nestled between the sea and hills on fertile land. With rolling green slopes and wine-colored waters lapping against a pebble beach, it seemed too peaceful for warriors to disturb. However, the Greeks had long forgotten the meaning of peace. For a decade, they had taken what they needed using blade and fire. Why should this moment be any different? Odysseus did not order them to land, yet he did not stop them either. Consequently, they did exactly what they had done in countless other cities. They landed as the sun broke, weapons drawn and torches blazing. The Cicons were caught entirely by surprise, with the morning fog still heavy and their guards drifting between sleep and wakefulness. The Greeks attacked with the ferocity of wolves. They cut down the defenders, chased women through the tight alleyways, smashed open the warehouses, and stripped the temples of their valuables. They ate stolen food, drank stolen wine, and cheered as they dragged enslaved locals toward the beach. This was not the first city these men had sacked, and it would not be the last. However, the atmosphere at Ismarus felt different. There was a heaviness to it, a sense of being watched. Odysseus urged his crew to take what they needed and depart immediately before the gods turned their gaze back toward them. He had witnessed what arrogance and hesitation could cause. He had watched Troy burn because of it. But the crew refused to listen. Drunk on their success and the wine, they demanded one more night of celebration. They felt they had lost too many friends and gained too little treasure. Laughing at the warnings, they held on to their captives, lit bonfires, and sang into the evening, believing the ocean and land would wait for them. They were wrong. At dawn, the Cicons returned, but they weren't the scattered stragglers from before. They were organized, armed, and reinforced by inland tribes. The hills were suddenly full of warriors, bronze armor flashing in the rising sun. The battle was instant and ruthless. The Greeks, still heavy with hangovers and sleep, scrambled to form lines on the sand. Arrows rained down from the ridges and spears cut through the surf. The fight was short, brutal, and lacked any glory. Men who had survived a decade against Trojans were now dying on a beach, killed by simple shepherds and farmers. The tide that once carried them to fame now threatened to pull them into disgrace. Odysseus fought with intense focus, rallying the survivors and ordering a retreat to the ships. Shields went up, oars hit the water, and with blood on their hands and curses in the air, they fled Ismarus, leaving their dead behind. 6 men from every ship were lost, their names destined to be forgotten by poets and history. Their graves were the shallow waters, their epitaphs nothing but silence. Once they were far enough out to see the smoke of their campfires mixing with the burning city, Odysseus sat on the deck, looking back with a blank stare. There was no victory in him, only the cold realization that they had caused this themselves. They had been warned that the gods never forgot. Ismarus wasn't a punishment, it was a reminder. The war was over, but the rules of blood and consequence remained. Behind him, the crew was silent, tending to wounds and whispering prayers, avoiding eye contact. The fire that drove them after Troy had faded. The world was vast, the sea deep, and the journey to Ithaca was longer than they feared. Out in the shifting blue, the gods were starting to wake up. In the days that followed, the sea turned strange. The winds blew in odd patterns, not with the violence of a storm, but with a dreamlike slowness that drifted the ships further south than anyone could chart. The constellations shifted, and the currents seemed to flow against memory itself. No gulls called out, and no dolphins followed the boats. The men rowed in silence, every stroke of the oar feeling more like a ritual than work, as if they were traveling through time instead of water. The sun hung pale and high, offering no warmth or clarity, and the men lost track of the hours. Odysseus stood at the tiller, watching the distance with concern. He felt it in his bones, a change. It wasn't a storm on the horizon, but something quieter and more dangerous, like a soft amnesia. When the land finally appeared, it came without warning. It was a low coastline, pale as bone, with strange groves of trees growing near the water. There were no towers, no walls, and no smoke from fires, just a deep hush. It was as if the island itself was sleeping. Odysseus ordered them to anchor in the clear shallows, where the sand shimmered like glass under the hull. He selected 3 men to scout, gave them specific orders, and watched them go ashore. They vanished into the trees like leaves in still air. Hours went by and the sun barely moved. When the scouts didn't return, Odysseus feared they had met some hidden danger. He armed himself and took his best men inland, following the trail of broken twigs. The forest was silent. The silence was absolute, yet it didn't feel malicious. Unfamiliar birds perched on the lower boughs, observing the men without letting out a single cry. The trees were heavy with a type of fruit Odysseus had never encountered before, round, golden orbs hanging low on fragile stems. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of honey and deep slumber. They eventually located the missing scouts near a pool of stagnant water, lying back in the shadows as if they were trapped in a dream. Their eyelids drooped, their bodies were completely relaxed, and their faces held a gentle, blissful expression usually reserved for the dying or the insane. Upon seeing Odysseus, the men smiled, yet made no attempt to stand up. One of them held out a handful of the soft, yellow fruit. His voice was slow and tranquil, sounding like a warm stone sinking into a quiet creek. He spoke of the local inhabitants, the Lotus eaters, describing how they had embraced the strangers as family, offering them food, comfort, and a home. This fruit, he explained, was their gift, the very core of their existence. But it wasn't nourishment, it was oblivion. A single bite pushed sorrow far away. One taste and the war vanished, while the long journey to Ithaca lost all meaning. Odysseus looked into their eyes and recognized the reality of their situation. The fruit had severed every connection they had to home and memory. They had no desire to fight, no will to run, and they wouldn't even ask to remain. They simply existed. A cold shiver ran down Odysseus's spine under his armor. This wasn't a poison that destroyed the body, but one that killed the will, which was a fate far worse. Without wasting a word, Odysseus grabbed the nearest man by his tunic and hauled him up from the grass. When the others started to argue, he silenced them with a command that was part king, part father. His crew followed his orders instantly. They bound the dazed men with ropes and carried them back to the shoreline. The scouts wept and pleaded to remain, referring to the fruit with names that sounded like lullabies. The sailors waiting at the ships watched in bewilderment as their comrades were tossed aboard like common cargo. However, once they saw the intense look in Odysseus's eyes and the tension in his jaw, they raised the sails without asking a single question. As the anchors lifted, the wind kicked up immediately, as if the ocean itself had been waiting for them to make a choice. As the island disappeared into the mist, Odysseus stood silently at the stern, watching the shoreline fade. The bound men wept for a loss they didn't understand, mourning a peace that wasn't truly theirs to keep. The island wasn't evil, but it held a dangerous softness, a profound kindness that erased one's roots. The Lotus eaters lived without war, glory, or longing, but they also lived without remembering their own names. That night, as the ocean moved beneath the hull and the stars watched from above like the eyes of ancient deities, Odysseus remained awake on watch. He thought of his wife, Penelope, and the son he hadn't seen in 2 decades. He remembered the graves of his fallen friends and the shipwrecks that surely lay ahead. The temptation to eat the fruit and silence the pain was real. One bite and the sea, the gods, and the suffering would all go quiet. But he did not eat. He dug his fingernails into his palms until they hurt, whispering the name of his home until it sounded less like a prayer and more like a sword. They sailed westward, battling a sullen, heavy wind that seemed to resent their escape from oblivion. The crew was quiet, their thoughts turned inward. Nobody mentioned the golden fruit or the peaceful dreams it promised. They rowed with hunched shoulders and dim eyes, moving away from something they couldn't name. Odysseus kept a firm grip on the tiller, his mind alert and burning like a fire. He realized their journey had entered a new phase of danger, defined not just by storms or battles, but by a slow erosion of the self. Every challenge left a scar. Every shore offered a different kind of end. Eventually, land appeared again, jutting out of the water like a jagged tooth. The coastline was steep and rough, with cliffs dropping sheer into the surf. There were no welcoming harbors and no smoke rising from chimneys. Beyond the bare, rough hills lay a higher ridge covered in scrub and stunted trees. Coasting along the shore, they found a small inlet, a half-moon cove protected by rocks and a reef, featuring a fresh spring and a meadow full of wild goats. It looked like the perfect place to repair sails and restock their supplies, so Odysseus gave the order to land. They pulled the ship ashore and gathered wood to start fires. Hunting was easy in the hills. The men slaughtered goats and feasted properly for the first time in days. While their spirits improved, Odysseus kept looking inland. From the high ridge, he had spotted something unusual, a massive cave mouth set into the cliffside like the maw of a sleeping beast. Next to it were strange pens constructed from stacked stone and timber. Sheep grazed there freely, showing no fear of men or fire. The land showed signs of habitation, yet there were no roads, fields, ships, or harbors. It was a place untouched by trade or war, isolated and quiet. Driven by curiosity and caution, Odysseus selected 12 men to explore inland at dawn, telling the others to guard the ship until he returned. He brought along a wineskin filled with incredibly potent vintage, a gift from a priest of Apollo he had spared during a raid. This wine was so strong it usually required 20 parts water to dilute, making it a secret weapon in a world ruled by brute force. As they climbed, the terrain grew stranger. There were no paths or plow marks, and the air was thick with the smell of animals and damp rock. The cave loomed larger with every step. When they finally reached it, they found the entrance shaded by overhanging rock and stained with the soot of old fires. Inside, they discovered giant clay jars filled with milk and cheese, racks of drying meat, and clean baskets. The scale of everything was wrong. The tools were crude but enormous, and the shelves reached a grown man's chest. Even the sheep were larger than normal, with thick wool and calm eyes. The men felt a growing unease, sensing that no ordinary shepherd lived here. However, hunger and the thrill of discovery pushed their caution aside. They lit a fire, cut slices of the giant cheese, and waited for the owner to return. He arrived at dusk. The sound of his footsteps alone was enough to freeze the blood in their veins, sounding like heavy stones shifting. The sheep entered first, docile and bleeding, followed by a massive silhouette. The giant blocked out the light, filling the mouth of the cave completely. He was as tall as the cavern's ceiling and as broad as 2 oxen yoked together. His face was uneven and brutish, but the men were paralyzed by the single eye in the center of his forehead. It was a massive, black orb that gleamed with a dim kind of intelligence. He moved with slow, deliberate weight, sealing the cave with a massive stone slab that required all his power to move. Then he turned toward the firelight and spotted them. He offered no hospitality, asked no questions, and gave no greetings. This Cyclops, a child of the deep earth and ancient gods, simply reached down and grabbed 2 men before they could stand. He smashed their heads against the rock and ate them raw, consuming bones and all. Blood spilled down his chin like wine. The Greeks screamed and scattered into the dark corners, but escape was impossible. The stone blocked the way out. They were trapped in the den of a monster older than memory, with nothing standing between them and death but their captain's wits. Odysseus stayed silent that night. He watched the giant sleep, his belly full of meat, snoring like a rumbling volcano. Odysseus formulated a plan, step by careful step. Fighting this beast was impossible. No weapon could pierce that thick hide. He had to be tricked. At sunrise, the Cyclops woke, milked his sheep, and ate another unfortunate Greek for breakfast. That was when Odysseus stepped up. He brought the wine. Bowing low, he offered the bowl with both hands, speaking like a humble traveler. The Cyclops was curious and drank. He loved the flavor and demanded more. Odysseus filled the bowl 3 times. The giant's speech began to slur. His eyelids grew heavy. Before passing out in a drunken stupor, he asked for the clever stranger's name. Odysseus smiled with cold calculation and answered, "My name is Nobody." The monster laughed and promised to eat Nobody last. Once the Cyclops collapsed into a wine-soaked sleep, Odysseus gathered his crew. He showed them a sharpened stake he had carved from green olive wood. They heated the tip in the fire until it glowed red. Then, summoning all their strength, they drove it straight into the Cyclops' single sleeping eye. The sound was like a wet tree splitting apart. The creature shrieked, thrashing and howling, tearing at the air in agony. The whole cave trembled. Blood and smoke poured from the ruined socket. He clawed at empty space, screaming for help from the other Cyclopes living in the nearby hills. They arrived outside the stone, asking what was wrong. The blind giant yelled, "Nobody has hurt me! Nobody is killing me!" Hearing this, the others cursed him for being drunk and left him to his pain. Odysseus and his men waited through the night while the Cyclops raged, blindly searching for them. They didn't dare sleep. At dawn, the giant rolled the stone away to let his sheep graze. Odysseus tied his men underneath the bellies of the largest rams. He held on beneath the biggest one of all, silent as a breath. The blinded Cyclops stood at the cave entrance, feeling the backs of the animals as they passed to check for men. He found none. The Greeks slipped past him, clinging to the wool. Once outside, they cut themselves free and sprinted to the ship. As they pushed off from the beach, Odysseus stood at the stern and shouted back at the cliffs. He couldn't help himself. Pride swelled in him like a rising tide, and he screamed his true name. "I am Odysseus of Ithaca. It was I who blinded you, monster. Tell your father it was I. Tell Poseidon." The Cyclops roared, raising his arms to the heavens, and called on the sea god, his father, to curse the man who stole his sight. Far beneath the waves, something ancient woke up. The ship sped away from the shore as fast as the oars could churn the water. The men rowed with the desperation of those who had looked death in the face and found it blind but still reaching for them. The gray, jagged cliffs of the island loomed behind them, lit by the pale morning sun. Smoke still spiraled from the cave, and the giant's howls echoed faintly over the water. The crew remained silent. Their hands were bloody from clutching the ropes under the sheep. Their backs hurt and their legs were raw, but they were alive. That was enough for the moment. Then Odysseus stood up again. The wind was at their backs and the sails were filling. The ship settled into a smooth rhythm, leaving the danger behind. He looked back at the shore, at the black cave mouth that had nearly swallowed them, and raised his voice again. He shouted not a goodbye, but a name, his own name, one that carried weight among kings. "I am Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca. Tell your father who blinded you. Tell him who outwitted you. Tell him who made you howl." The men froze, the oars slipped, eyes turned to their captain in shock. It was as if he had thrown a rock into still water and they were watching the ripples spread. For a second everything was quiet. The cliffs stood high. Waves lapped the hull, sheep bleated in the distance. Then the roar arrived. A voice like mountains cracking, heavy with pain and rage, hit the sea like a hammer. The Cyclops had heard, and he summoned his father. Poseidon, earth shaker, lord of the sea, brother of Zeus and Hades, god of salt, storm, and vengeance. The sea, which had been smooth moments ago, began to tremble. The winds convulsed. Clouds swarmed together in a sky that had been empty just moments before. The water itself seemed to take a deep, heaving breath right under the hull. The heavens turned the color of cold iron, and every sailor on that ship felt a heavy dread settle in their stomachs like a stone, knowing with certainty that the ocean would never be safe again. Poseidon heard the curse his son screamed through broken teeth and bloody lips. The god didn't say a word back. He didn't have to. His answer appeared in the shifting tides, the sudden pitching of the boat, and the pull of invisible forces. You could see the answer in the tightening of Odysseus's jaw. It was in the way his eyes scanned the horizon for storms that hadn't formed yet, but definitely would. He understood his mistake. His arrogance had caused a deeper wound than the stake driven into the Cyclops' eye. He had announced himself to the heavens, and gods never forget. They found no shelter that night. Winds pushed them south, east, and back west, as if the sea couldn't decide where to throw them. Clouds masked the stars. The moon looked like a sharp knife before vanishing entirely. The crew clung to the rails, whispering prayers to silent gods. Some wept, others cursed, but everyone kept turning their eyes toward Odysseus. He was the one who brought them to Troy and led them out of the cave. But he was also the one who spoke too loudly, angering the god who ruled the waves beneath them. Odysseus didn't sleep. He stood at the stern, gripping the tiller and his cloak. His face was unreadable, carved from the same stone as the cliffs they had escaped. He stayed silent, but shame burned inside him hotter than the pride that started this. He had outsmarted a monster, but he forgot that monsters have fathers, divine fathers with long memories and infinite reach. When the sun rose through the mist, the sea calmed down. However, this silence promised nothing good. It wasn't peace. It wasn't mercy. It was the breath before a storm. Odysseus, though still far from home, knew deep down he had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The ocean would rise against him repeatedly, not because of an accidental sin, but because he shouted his name in victory. The gods simply do not tolerate mortals who forget their place. The sea gave them no rest, only tiny breaks in the torture. The days following Poseidon's curse were grim. Men were hunched and hollow-eyed from lack of sleep. Mornings brought uncertainty, evenings carried the scent of dread. The wind didn't howl but whispered with strange voices, shifting direction with unmappable malice. The stars seemed to lose their meaning. Constellations looked twisted and unfamiliar, while the moon vanished more often than it appeared. Odysseus stood at the helm through most of it, hands raw from salt and rope, staring past the waves. He wasn't just navigating the water anymore. He was navigating the will of the gods, and that is a much harsher current. On the 12th day after fleeing the Cyclops, they found a place unlike any other. A smooth, green island rose from the swells, its cliffs topped with towers of polished bronze that blazed like fire in the sun. The shore was calm, the harbor gentle, and the air smelled of cedar and spice rather than salt and decay. The crew exhaled, finally breathing easy. Even the water seemed to relax as they approached, bowing to the strange power residing there. This was the floating Isle of Aeolia, home to the Keeper of the Winds. Aeolus's halls were carved into the cliff and polished until the stone gleamed like pearl. The king wasn't a warrior or priest, but a warden appointed by Zeus to manage the winds. His palace vibrated with shifting air, and his children's voices echoed like birdsong. Aeolus received Odysseus with the courtesy of an old ally, though they had never met. He knew about the sack of Troy. The whole world did, and in Odysseus he recognized not just a war veteran but something else, something ancient and clever. They feasted. For a solid month they dined and drank within the great hall, resting beneath elaborate frescoes while the gale prowled around the building like a pack of wolves waiting for the doors to unlatch. Aeolus listened intently as Odysseus recounted every step of their voyage so far. He spoke of Troy's destruction, the raid on the Cicons, the dangerous fruit of the Lotus eaters, and the terror they faced in the Cyclops cave. The Wind King said very little in response, yet his expression grew grim as the tale went on, as if he could detect the faint vibration of divine anger that was beginning to stalk Odysseus. When the story concluded, Aeolus presented him with a parting gift. It was neither gold nor armor, but something far simpler and immensely more powerful. He produced a massive oxhide sack, inside of which he had trapped every wind that could blow the ships off course. He tied it shut with a silver cord, promising that as long as the bag remained closed, no storm would plague them. Only the gentle west wind was left free to push them safely toward home. Ithaca sat just past the edge of the known world, and if they sailed true and the gods were kind, they could arrive in 10 days. Odysseus bowed low, accepting the present with overwhelming gratitude. They launched the following dawn under clear skies and calm waters. The fleet cut through the waves, pushed by a west wind that filled the canvas like the breath of Athena herself. Laughter and singing returned to the crew, and some wept tears of secret happiness. As strange coastlines faded into the distance, the hope of home glowed ahead of them like a beacon. Initially, Odysseus refused to sleep. He stayed right by the mast where the bag was tied with a knot that required a blade to undo. When the men asked about the contents, he claimed it was merely an offering for the gods and nothing more. However, as time wore on, exhaustion caught up with him. Just as the pale cliffs of Ithaca became visible through the mist, appearing as a faint whisper on the horizon, Odysseus finally allowed himself to rest. Closing his eyes meant closing the door on his vigilance. The crew's suppressed curiosity had festered into suspicion. Because the bag was never opened and Odysseus guarded it like gold, they began whispering that it must contain hoarded treasure. They imagined stolen riches or spoils from Troy sufficient to purchase 10 kingdoms and live like deities. In the quiet hours of the night, while Odysseus drifted into dreams of holding Penelope and hearing Telemachus, Two sailors sneaked up and sliced the silver cords with a knife. The bag burst open with a groan, releasing the screaming winds. Instantly, the ship jerked violently, the sky turned black, and the ocean swelled with a rage unseen for weeks. Waves swamped the deck while sails shredded, and men shrieked as they were tossed from their seats. Odysseus awoke to absolute chaos, finding his ship being blown backward through time and space. The image of Ithaca vanished like a phantom. Driven in circles by the gale, days blurred together until their hope unraveled completely. When they eventually washed up on the shores of Aeolia again, beaten and starving, Odysseus walked up the hill alone. He cradled the deflated bag in his arms as one might carry a lifeless child. Iolaus met him at the entrance, realizing the situation before a word was uttered. Stepping back and shaking his head, the king declared that the gods had clearly turned against them. Refusing to aid a man cursed by heaven, he ordered Odysseus to leave and never return. And so they returned to the open water, facing unbound winds and the silence of the gods, with the memory of home flickering just out of reach. Odysseus stood at the bow with empty hands and a grim stare. The time for gifts was over, only hardships remained. The restless ocean was now carrying them toward a new shore where death awaited in a different guise. The sea is a patient predator that doesn't need to roar to destroy you. It can lull you into a false sense of safety before striking. After departing Aeolia the second time, with winds howling through the ropes and the gods remaining cold and distant, Odysseus and his crew found themselves drifting, not in a storm, but in an eerie stillness. The gray sky hung low, and the waves moved with a silence that wasn't peaceful, but rather felt like the tense moment before a sword is unsheathed. As days dragged on, food supplies dwindled and the water turned foul. The men stopped asking questions or whispering about the gods. Their prayers turned into private mutterings directed at the deck planks or the overcast sky, words never meant for others to hear. Eventually, land appeared, a coastline curling into the ocean like a massive claw. Steep cliffs cast long shadows, seemingly scraping the underside of the clouds. The harbor was deep and narrow, holding water that was dark and unnaturally calm as though the ocean had ceased breathing. There were no signs of civilization, no fishing vessels, no chimney smoke, no roads or pastures. However, a faint, unpleasant smell hung in the air, reminiscent of meat spoiling in the heat. Despite this, the men were exhausted, and this place looked like a sanctuary after their aimless drifting. Odysseus ordered the sails dropped. One by one, the ships slid into the harbor, their hulls swaying gently on the black water. All of them entered except for one. Odysseus, remaining wary where others saw safety, held back. Driven by intuition, he kept his own vessel anchored outside the harbor. Past losses had taught him not to trust calm waters or high cliffs implicitly. Instead, he selected a small group of scouts to go ashore. They trudged up a steep, narrow path, their boots slipping on the slick rocks, weapons drawn more from exhaustion than aggression. At the summit, they discovered a settlement that barely qualified as a city. It was not built of bronze or stone, but consisted of crude dwellings dug into the earth or stacked from heavy boulders. A heavy stench of smoke and blood hung in the air. They spotted a tall, pale young woman holding a pitcher at a well. When she noticed the strangers, she didn't speak but bolted between the structures, and the confused sailors chased after her. That chase was a fatal mistake, leading them straight into a trap. The girl hadn't gone to fetch her father but her king, and this ruler was a massive giant with granite-colored skin and merciless eyes. Before anyone could react, this monster grabbed a sailor, snapped his spine over a knee, and threw the body against a wall, painting the rocks with blood. As the others tried to flee, the reality set in. These were the Laestrygonians, an ancient tribe of cannibals who hungered for human flesh rather than gold. The narrow harbor below turned into a slaughterhouse. Giants swarmed from the stone houses like bears leaving a cave, raining down boulders as large as oxen onto the trapped fleet. The cliffs provided the monsters with the high ground, and they used it to devastating effect. Ships shattered against the harbor walls one by one. Men who jumped into the water were speared from the shore or grabbed by claw-like hands and torn apart. The sea turned crimson while screams rivaled the noise of a storm. Only Odysseus, who had wisely kept his ship in the open sea, avoided the destruction. Seeing the carnage and hearing the bones breaking against timber, he ordered his crew to row for their lives. They didn't hesitate, powering the black ship away from the cove as the other vessels burned. Behind them, the giants roared in victory, their mouths wet from their feast. Once the cursed land disappeared beneath the horizon, Odysseus surveyed the aftermath. 11 ships and their crews were gone in a single morning. Hundreds of veterans who had survived a decade of war were now devoured. The survivors wept quietly, too broken to scream or demand revenge. They had faced monsters and gods before, but this was different. It was raw, predatory hunger that stripped them of everything but the will to live. That night Odysseus stood at the prow, silent and tearless, listening to the wind and counting the dead by the heaviness in his chest. As dawn broke, he turned away from the light, holding onto the only thing the gods had left him, his journey. The lone remaining ship carried a crew that looked more like ghosts than men, drifting through the sea in shock. The survivors of the Laestrygonian nightmare sailed in silence, their skin pulled tight over their bones. The ship's timbers creaked louder than the men spoke. Even Odysseus, usually a pillar of iron will, stood like a statue carved from grief, watching the horizon with the quiet intensity of a man who expects nothing but fears everything. Eventually, a new island appeared through the mist like a half-remembered dream. This was Aea, a lush, green land with gentle shores and forests of oak and cedar crowned by smoky hills. It seemed peaceful, full of life and birdsong, but after the recent horror, the men no longer trusted their eyes. They beached the ship with extreme caution, stepping onto the sand as if entering a battlefield, aware that danger often disguised itself with beauty. They set up camp on the shore, burning driftwood and hunting the abundant deer and boar. As the smell of roasted meat filled the air, the men began to speak again, their laughter returning slowly like birds learning to fly after winter. However, Odysseus remained vigilant. The island was too pristine and untouched by war or ruin, which made him suspicious of what lay hidden. On the third day, he sent a 20-man scouting party led by his cautious lieutenant, Eurylochus. They followed a winding path past whispering streams and fearless animals until they reached a clearing. There, a polished stone mansion with a copper roof gleamed in the sunlight like a jewel. Strange, tame animals roamed the grounds, and a woman's beautiful, low voice drifted from inside, weaving a hypnotic song. While Eurylochus urged them to pull back, the hungry men approached the door. It opened to reveal Circe. She was stunning, as the stories would later recount, but her power lay in her calm stillness, as if she knew their entire histories just by looking at them. She invited them into a hall filled with light, food, and wine that glowed like garnet in gold cups. Everyone entered except Eurylochus, who sensed a trap. He waited outside, listening to their laughter rise, but when silence fell and no one returned, he fled in terror. He returned to the ship pale and shaking, reporting that the men had vanished and the woman was something ancient and cruel. Without wasting a moment, Odysseus strapped on his sword and shield and marched toward the house alone. The wind caught his cloak like wings as the earth seemed to watch him pass. Along the path, he encountered a young man with bright eyes, Hermes, the messenger of Olympus, in disguise. The god warned him that Circe was the daughter of Helios, a sorceress who had turned his crew into pigs that now ate from her hand. To save him, Hermes offered a magical herb called moly, a black-stemmed plant with a white flower. The god explained that this gift would make Odysseus immune to her spells. Thanking him, Odysseus arrived at the mansion and knocked. The hall was exactly as described, warm and smelling of food. Circe sat at the table, watching him with an unreadable smile as she mixed a potion with her silver wand. She whispered an incantation and handed him the cup. He drank it down, but the magic failed to take hold. She stepped forward to strike him with her magic staff, yet Odysseus was faster, drawing his blade. The steel sliced through the air, halting just millimeters from her throat. Circe stood motionless, and for a split second time itself appeared to freeze alongside her. Then she laughed not in mockery but with a tone resembling relief. "You are different from the rest," she admitted. Breathing heavily, Odysseus lowered his weapon. She pledged his safety, kissing his hand to signify a truce. The enchantment shattered and the crew returned to their human forms. Circe honored her promise. The men who had been swine moments before stood upright once more. They stumbled from the skies, blinking in confusion, their minds resurfacing like divers from the deep ocean. As animals, they had lived in a fog of instinct, unaware of their state, but as the haze lifted, shame took its place. They recalled the laughter, the wine, and the warmth of her hall. They remembered their trust in her. That betrayal stung the most. Circe faced them, begging for forgiveness. Her gaze was direct and her voice gentle, though it was impossible to tell if her regret was real or a well-rehearsed act. Regardless, Odysseus did not attack. He put away his sword and accepted her hospitality. Perhaps he had witnessed too much cruelty to identify kindness, or perhaps he understood that even monsters grow tired of their own nature. She led them into her palace, offering food, beds, and music in the twilight. Her handmaidens moved silently as shadows with downcast eyes, while the building itself seemed to breathe. Colorful stones paved the floors, tapestries lined the walls, and the air carried the scent of exotic herbs and flowers found only on this island. The nights were warm and filled with conversation. For the first time in months, the men laughed without bitterness. They set aside their weapons, washed away the blood, and allowed their wounds to heal. Days became weeks, and weeks stretched into months, yet they remained. Circe was more than a witch. She was a goddess older than Olympus, born of fire, stars, and sea. Her voice could enslave a heart or drive a man insane, yet she was lonely. In Odysseus, she discovered a mental equal, not just a fighter. Under torchlight, they spent hours discussing the cosmos, the dead, the gods, and the silence between names. She served him wine without prying. He mentioned Ithaca occasionally, though less frequently than before. She listened and smiled. When they were intimate, she did not flinch, so he stayed. The crew considered it a blessing. They ate well and slept in soft beds, forgetting the terror of drowning, hunger, and their fallen comrades. The ship gathered moss on the beach, oars stacked like firewood, sails folded and dry. Odysseus explored the hills with Circe, watching the seasons change. They talked of ancient cities and songs and shadows beneath the waves. War and Poseidon were never mentioned. The curse felt distant, left behind under a different sky. But deities neither forget nor forgive easily. Dreams eventually end. One sunset, as the hills turned bronze, Odysseus stood on a cliff looking west. Ithaca was now more a memory than a destination. The image of Penelope and the voice of Telemachus were fading like wind over stone. He felt the burden of time and realized he had stayed too long. A moment of peace had become a year. Circe realized it too. She watched him pace that night and the next morning solemnly explained the path forward. He could not sail a normal route but had to enter the land of the dead. She instructed him to sail to the world's edge, where the river ocean encircles the earth and shadows roam. There he must find Tiresias, the blind Theban prophet whose soul retains knowledge lost to the living. Only Tiresias could reveal how to navigate Poseidon's curse. Only the dead could guide a traveler trapped between home and ruin. Odysseus agreed without argument. She provided the rituals, signs, sacred blood, and a black ram. She taught him the incantations. Her voice was steady, but her hand lingered on his arm a moment too long as he turned to go. The next day the ship was prepared in silence. The spell was broken. The sanctuary was now a fading memory. Circe watched from the shore, raising a hand in farewell. As the ship slipped into the gloom, the goddess diminished until she looked like just another woman abandoned by war. The air grew cold as they sailed to the world's far reaches, void of sun and stars. The wind smelled of ash and salt, rising from the earth's bones. The men stopped speaking of home or gods. They rowed grimly, knowing they sailed not toward land, but toward the edge of death. Odysseus stood alone at the prow, wrapped in Circe's cloak, his eyes locked upon the horizon that grew darker with every passing hour. He refused to look back. Everything that needed to be said had been spoken. He carried the necessary rites, the sacrificial animals, the wine, and the barley, along with the specific instructions from the enchantress who understood the secrets of the stars and the smell of magic. He possessed no bravery, only a sense of obligation, marching wearily like a man who has lost every reason to continue, but must walk into the shadows to discover the end of the road. Eventually, they arrived at the river Ocean, a black, infinite body of water that wrapped around the edge of the world like a slumbering serpent with one watchful eye. The surface didn't ripple. It moved with the quiet of ancient thoughts, lined by gray trees that were as bare as skeletons. No birds sang and no insects buzzed. There was only the wind moaning through empty branches and the gentle slap of water against the ship's hull. Odysseus ordered the crew to halt. They beached the ship on the shore of a place that wasn't truly land. He stepped onto the freezing ground with the slow caution of someone entering a tomb that had been sealed for centuries. Drawing his sword, he began the ritual. In total silence, they dug a square pit into the dark earth. Into this cut in the world, he poured the offerings: honey, wine, water, sacred barley, and the blood of the black ram. He slit the animal's throat, and its life drained out with a hiss that sounded deafening in the cursed quiet. Behind him, the men stood terrified, mouths dry and eyes wide. They gripped their cloaks tightly, afraid to breathe too deeply, sensing that the air was shifting and the darkness was beginning to stir. The dead approached in silence, pale forms drifting from the shadows like solid smoke, drawn by the smell of blood and the memory of breathing. Their eyes were empty, and their mouths hung open as if to speak, though no sound came. They crowded around the pit with an ancient hunger, reaching out with bowed heads. Odysseus stood his ground over the hole, sword in hand, guarding the offering. He called out into the gloom, keeping his voice steady and low, asking for Tiresias, the blind prophet and son of Evers, the only one who knew the paths hidden even by the gods. However, Tiresias was not the first to appear. One by one, the ghosts drifted past, faces he recognized, names etched into his mind. He saw Elpenor, the youngest member of his crew who had gotten drunk at Circe's palace and fallen from the roof, breaking his neck like a twig. Elpenor begged him, not for revenge or justice, but for a proper burial. He asked not to be left unburned and restless, but for Odysseus to build him a mound and place his oar atop it. Odysseus promised he would. He took the young man's plea to heart, and sent him back into the darkness with that small assurance. Then another spirit rose. It was a tall, dignified, and quiet woman, Anticlea, his mother. She had died before he could return, passing away without knowing he had survived. Her eyes held an expression too deep for words, neither anger nor sorrow, but the timeless silence of mothers who have waited and watched until they faded. She spoke of Ithaca and Penelope, who was still grieving at her loom, and of Telemachus, who had grown into a man without a father's guidance. She described the suitors, the vultures swarming his home and feasting on his absence. Hearing this, Odysseus wept. These were not the tears of a king or a warrior, but of a man realizing how much he had lost while marching endlessly forward. He tried to embrace her, but she slipped through his arms like wind through reeds. The dead cannot be held, they can only remember. Finally, Tiresias arrived. The prophet was tall and thin. Although his eyes were closed in death, his face seemed to see everything. He stood at the edge of the pit, drank the blood, and began to speak in an ancient tongue. He told Odysseus exactly what he needed to hear, rather than what he hoped for. The journey home would be long, painful, and slow. Poseidon's anger had not faded, and the sea would offer no forgiveness. He warned him about Thrinacia, the island where the sun god's sacred cattle grazed, animals no man should touch. He spoke of Scylla and Charybdis, of storms and sirens. He predicted the battle with the wolves in human form filling his house. And finally, he foretold a gentle death far from the sea, coming only after peace was earned and the world had forgotten his name. That would be his rest. The wind picked up and the river groaned. Drawn by the scent of life, the dead began to move closer, their hands reaching and mouths gaping wide. Odysseus raised his sword and stepped back. He ordered his men to retreat, and together they fled the pit, leaving the darkness and the blood soaking into the haunted shore. They ran to the ship and launched it, and the sea accepted them back, colder than before but familiar. The world of the living wrapped around them like a heavy, burdensome cloak. Odysseus remained silent. He sat at the stern, staring at the horizon while the ghosts of the dead marched through his mind. The prophet's voice still echoed in his head, and he couldn't wash the smell of blood from his hands. The journey had to continue because the gods demanded it, but something inside him had changed. He had walked among the dead and met their gaze. He felt the weight of his absence and the truth of time. Even as his ship moved forward, his spirit was turning back. The sea met them again with silence rather than fury, stretching out as an endless gray plain under a static sky. The wind filled the sails without joy or promise of home. Odysseus sat at the prow like a figure carved from driftwood, his eyes hardened by memory and prophecy. With the voice of Tiresias still clinging to his thoughts like cobwebs, he realized now that leaving the underworld was merely the beginning, not the end. There would be no simple journey back. The challenges waiting for him would not test the sharpness of his blade, but rather his self-control, his intellect, and the determination of the damaged men who still looked to him for leadership. He understood that their pain was not a penalty for failing. It was simply the toll they had to pay to return. Home wasn't a prize to be seized in combat anymore. It was a destination they had to endure long enough to reach. Leaving the dark coast where the dead had whispered and wept, Circe's island rose on the horizon once more, appearing faint and distant like a dissolving dream. They stopped just long enough to keep their promise to Elpenor. On the beach, they piled stones into a mound above the tide and planted the young man's oar upright in the soil, a simple monument to everything they had left behind. Odysseus spoke only a few words, but they carried weight. The ocean listened, the gods listened, and perhaps even the boy's spirit, floating on whatever breeze carries the dead, paused to hear his name spoken one final time. Circe was waiting for them at the water's edge, her eyes burdened with a solitary wisdom. She didn't mention the horror etched into his face. Instead, she spoke of the future. She warned of dangers that had no names, monsters born not from the gods but from the empty voids between their breaths. Using a stick to draw maps in the sand while the waves hissed nearby, she whispered ancient cautions. First, there would be sirens, creatures with voices as sharp as bone and sweet as honey. Their song lured sailors not with physical lust, but with a deep spiritual longing. It wasn't the body's desire they targeted, but the soul's thirst for forbidden secrets. No man who heard their music ever returned. They jumped from their decks willingly, reaching out for nothing, smiling as they drowned. To survive, Odysseus took action. He melted wax and pressed it into the ears of every crewmate. He alone remained unblocked, but he had himself lashed upright to the mast, the ropes knotted so tight his arms bled. He gave strict orders. No matter how much he screamed or begged, they were never to untie him. The ship drifted into calm waters and the air grew heavy. There was no land in sight, no birds, just a swirling mist and a sudden sound that didn't echo because it occupied every inch of space at once. It wasn't a single voice, but a multitude. It wasn't just one song, but every song. It sang of home, of mothers waiting by the fire, of lovers reaching out, and of children who knew his name. Odysseus screamed. He wept. He pleaded. He tore at his bonds until the skin peeled from his wrists. Yet the crew rowed on, staring ahead with empty eyes and ears sealed with wax. Finally, the sirens appeared, pale, beautiful, and terrible shapes perched on rocks that glittered with the bones of previous dreamers. They sang until the ocean itself shivered. Then, as the ship drifted out of range, the music cut off instantly. The sudden silence hit with the force of a bell tolling. The trance shattered. Odysseus slumped against the mast, speechless until the island vanished into the fog. But the ocean wasn't done with them. That song was merely the opening act. Circe had warned him of a cruel, narrow strait that followed. On one side waited Scylla, the eater of men, a nightmare with 6 long necks and mouths filled with spear-like teeth. On the other side churned Charybdis, a living whirlpool that drank the tide and spat it out with a fury that could shatter the sky. The gap between them was barely a stone's throw wide. Every path involved blood. The choice was between the storm or the fangs, the drowning depths or the teeth. Odysseus chose Scylla. He kept the truth from his men, knowing that fear would only steal the strength from their hands. Instead, he commanded them to row hard and steady. Taking the helm himself, he steered toward the cliffs where Scylla hid like a spider in its web. The water turned black, the wind screamed constantly, and the passage tightened until it felt like they were sailing down a throat. Then the attack came. There was no warning, no growl, just the sudden crack of those terrible necks and jaws snapping like thunder. In a single breath, 6 men were snatched from the deck, screaming as they were dragged into the mist above. Their swords fell uselessly to the floorboards. Their names disappeared into the sea foam. The survivors could only row, teeth clenched and hearts frozen, as the ship lurched forward, splinters flying from the hull and the sea roaring around them. To their left, Charybdis opened its maw, revealing a swirling black abyss, but the current swept them clear just before it snapped shut. The whirlpool collapsed with a sound like the earth cracking. Soaked by spray, the men gasped, feeling like they had been born again. There were no cheers, no tears. They simply kept rowing. When the sun finally pierced the clouds, it looked pale and distant. Odysseus counted the oars and stared at the empty benches. He remembered every name. He would always remember them. The sea didn't care, the sea had no memory, but he carried their stories like heavy stones, the burden growing with every mile. And still, Ithaca waited. Beyond the strait, the waters calmed. The sky cleared and the sun lingered longer overhead. The waves settled into a gentle rhythm that lulled the men into quiet, but this wasn't true peace. It was the silence that follows a scream, the stillness after a wound is inflicted but before the blood stops flowing. The crew spoke little. They worked in a rhythmic trance, their faces gaunt and sunburned. There were fewer of them now. Each empty seat on the ship stood as a marker for a lost friend. There was no need to say their names. The memory of their screams still vibrated in the wood beneath their feet. Odysseus didn't rest. He stayed at the prow, watching the horizon with an unblinking gaze. The knowledge given by Tiresias and Circe still pressed against his chest like a stone around his neck. They had specifically warned him about one location above all others, an island sacred to Helios, the sun god. Here, the cattle of heaven grazed in perpetual light, golden beasts untouched by time or mortal hands, watched over by divine eyes. The punishment for harming them would be instant and absolute. No excuses would be heard. No other god would step in to help. The sun himself had made the decree. The cattle were sacred. To kill one was to strike at the sky itself. But men are weak, and hunger is a crueler master than any sword. As they sailed, a harsh wind rose, wild and steady, driving them off course. No matter how tightly Odysseus gripped the rudder, the gods were steering now. They weren't guiding blindly or kindly, but with purpose. The ship was pushed directly toward the island they needed to avoid. They tried to circle it, looking for a way past, but the storm refused to let them go. With every attempt to leave, the waves grew higher and more violent. Eventually, with provisions running low and the crew muttering in fear, Odysseus gave in. They dropped anchor in a bay where the water shimmered with unnatural stillness and the land glowed under a sun that never set. The cattle grazed in meadows of green and gold, their horns ivory white, their eyes calm. They were perfect, untouched, and eternal. Odysseus gathered his crew immediately and made them swear a solemn oath. He repeated the prophet's warning. He echoed the words of Circe. He looked into every man's eyes and warned them that death would come to anyone who touched the livestock. They nodded in agreement. They whispered solemn vows. They swore on their own lives and the memories of the loved ones they had lost. For a short while, they actually listened. But patience becomes an enemy when stomachs are empty and the weather refuses to break. The wind simply died. Days stretched into weeks. A stagnant storm sat over the island, bringing no rain or thunder, just endless wind, hunger, and silence. Their supplies vanished. They tried to fish and hunt, but the island seemed determined to starve them. Birds flew too high to catch, and the trees offered fruit too bitter to swallow. The air itself felt oppressive, as if the god who ruled there was staring them down, waiting for them to crack. Eventually, they did. It started while Odysseus had walked inland, seeking some solitude or perhaps a final message from the gods. While he was gone, Eurylochus, always persuasive and moody, stood before the crew to make his case. He argued that it was better to drown at sea for disobedience than to starve like animals beneath the open sky. Why should they suffer hunger when food was standing right in the field? These weren't mortal beasts, they were sacred. Maybe their meat wouldn't rot. Maybe it would actually save them. He insisted this wasn't rebellion, it was necessity. So they killed. They selected the best cattle, the golden ones with broad backs and gentle eyes. They built a fire and offered prayers, turning the slaughter into a ritual. But it was a sham, a flimsy veil over a crime the heavens already knew about. The scent of roasting meat drifted up to the sky, reaching the place where the sun's chariot paused. Helios saw exactly what had happened. He turned toward Olympus and demanded justice. He threatened that if Zeus did not punish these men, he would shine his light into the underworld and leave the earth in eternal darkness. The gods listened. They nodded. The verdict was sealed. Odysseus walked back to the smell of cooking flesh and the laughter of men drunk on false hope. He realized instantly what they had done. His rage was quiet, his words scarce. There was no point screaming at the doomed. The oaths were shattered. The curse had been triggered. All that remained was to wait and see how the hammer would fall, and it would fall soon. They set sail again under a sky that had lost all kindness. The storm that had gripped the island like a shroud vanished the moment the ship left the shore, as if the winds had just been waiting for the sin to be completed. The ocean opened up before them, vast and tranquil. Yet the stillness felt wrong. The clouds drifted too slowly. The air hung heavy and motionless. Even the seagulls that usually circled overhead were gone. The sun blazed down with a scorching intensity that offered no warmth. There was no joy in the wind, only silence. In that quiet, Odysseus could feel the gods watching. Not all of them, just one, Helios. The sun god's rage wasn't loud, it was patient. Punishment waited until the men began to hope again. It held back until they dared to speak of Ithaca, imagining their hearths and the voices of family greeting them on the beach. They hummed soft songs, they laughed, they looked at the horizon and called it beautiful. For a moment they believed the curse had missed them, thinking the gods were just as tired as they were. Odysseus didn't join them. He sat alone by the mast, hands clasped, eyes dark. He knew better. He had seen the pattern of divine cruelty. The gods didn't forget. They simply waited for the perfect moment to teach their lesson. When that moment arrived, it came with thunder. The sky split open like a skull. Clouds that had been white and soft turned charcoal black, spinning into a storm with no center. The waves rose in silence, then crashed down, tall as mountains and fast as arrows. The wind shrieked, the sea boiled, and lightning snapped the mast, setting the sail on fire. The ship bucked like a dying beast. Oars shattered in their locks. The deck ripped apart beneath their feet. One by one, they were tossed into the water, swallowed by the sea that had always been waiting to reclaim them. They didn't scream for long. They didn't rise again. Odysseus clung to a piece of wreckage, drifting like a bone in a battlefield. All around him, the ocean howled, waves crashing against each other like screaming voices without tongues. The storm didn't pass quickly. It lingered, dragging him across the water, spinning him through foam and darkness, echoing the roar of a disrespected god. The heavens raged and the sea answered. There was no salvation, only survival, and even that was brutal. Finally, when the ship was smashed into so many pieces it could no longer be called a ship, and the men had vanished into the deep, the storm faded. The waves softened. The sky cleared. The sea returned to its usual calm, as if nothing had happened, as if the violence had never been. With the storm reduced to a mere memory of bad weather, only Odysseus was left. He remained solitary, holding fast to a fractured timber, floating along with the tide like a piece of driftwood, simply too stubborn to let himself sink. He drifted for days as time lost all meaning. The sun hammered down without mercy, while salt crusted over his eyes and cracked lips. His skin blistered and hunger gnawed at his stomach, while sleep offered only shivers and waking nightmares. The faces of his crew returned to him. He saw Eurylochus, Perimedes, and the young men of Ithaca who used to laugh at his tales by the campfire. Now they were nothing but sea foam and memories. He shouted their names to the ocean, but the water gave no reply. It had already taken the debt it was owed, but the gods were not finished with him yet. There was still one final island, one last examination to pass. One more chapter remained before this tale could find its rest. For the moment, Odysseus drifted alone under a blinding sky and across an endless ocean. He was a man neither fully dead nor truly alive. Pulled by the current toward an invisible fate, he could feel like a cold breath waiting just past the edge of sleep. He floated for 9 days and 9 nights, though the count meant nothing to a captain who had lost his vessel, his men, and his grasp on time. The sun rose and set, but he stopped tracking it. He held the wreckage by instinct rather than willpower, half blind from the salt and scorched by the heavens. The waves carried him as gently as they would a corpse, cradled by the deep and rocked by winds he was too numb to feel. Through rain, heat, silence, and storms, he saw only flashes of the past between the long blinks of his dry, cracked eyelids. He saw Penelope weaving in solitude within the great hall of Ithaca. He saw Telemachus pacing their island shores, shouting for a father whose name had turned into a question. He saw his men smiling under the sun at Troy, whole, proud, and still believing they would make it home. Those images faded like breath on glass until only the heavy weight of his own respiration remained. He didn't pray, for he had forgotten the words. It was the sea that decided to spare him. Or maybe it was a god, though none stepped up to claim the credit. On the 10th day, his broken body washed onto the sands of Odyssey, a place hidden in the world's folds where maps couldn't reach, untouched by time or war. The sand was soft and pale, the trees bowed with fruit, and green vines cascaded down the cliffs. Birds sang melodies no soldier had ever heard, and the air was thick with the perfume of unseasonal flowers. There were no ruins, screams, or bones here, just the hum of a paradise that had no need to remember human names. That was where Calypso found him. She was a daughter of the gods, born of twilight and the sea, ancient as the rain yet appearing like a girl in her prime. Her hair was the color of dark wine, her voice was slower than sleep, and her eyes were unreadable. She stood over his shattered form without scorn or pity, possessing the stillness of someone accustomed to seeing lost things wash up at her feet. She gathered him into her arms and carried him to her cave, a stone hollow filled with warm pools, sweet smoke, and draped in ivy. She washed the salt crust from his skin, wrapped him in fresh linen, and laid him on a bed of moss, letting the wind lull him into a dreamless slumber. He didn't wake for 7 days and 7 nights. When he finally opened his eyes and saw her face, he assumed he had died. But she just smiled and said, "No, you are not dead, though perhaps you wish you were." Over time, he regained his strength slowly, like an old tree remembering how to bloom. His tremors stopped and his breathing steadied. He ate her fruit and drank from springs so clear they reflected the sky in every drop. His skin healed and the pain left his bones, but the deeper wound did not mend. Every morning he sat at the cave's entrance, watching the sea as if it still owed him something. Calypso brought him food and songs, but he ate little and sang nothing. When she asked what he was looking for in the waves, he answered, "Only Ithaca," and though she didn't flinch, her eyes darkened. She offered him far more than just recovery. She proposed a place by her side, a life of ease without sorrow or war. She offered a deathless existence in the arms of an immortal who could keep him young for eternity. No aging, no pain, no kings, and no gods. It would be just the two of them alone on an unchanging island. She told him he was loved, that he had suffered enough, and that the world of men had nothing left to give him. And maybe she was right. Perhaps the gods had exhausted their mercy. Maybe Penelope was dead or remarried, and perhaps Telemachus had forgotten his name. Maybe Ithaca wasn't waiting anymore. Yet Odysseus still refused. Each morning he took his place on the same rock, gazing west. He did this not out of hope or belief, but because he couldn't bear to stop. He had survived too much to surrender now. Even in paradise, his heart beat for a home that might not exist. Calypso didn't argue further. She watched him the way one watches a dying fire, knowing it will eventually fade but unable to look away. She didn't beg or rage, she simply waited. Meanwhile, high above where Olympus pierced the clouds and the gods spoke in earth-shaking murmurs, the name of Odysseus was spoken once more. And finally, someone listened. Far above Ogyges' gentle waves, beyond the clouds, the winds, and the reach of mortal breath, the halls of Olympus shimmered in firelight and gold. There, under ceilings gleaming like hammered bronze and columns carved from the bones of the earth, the gods looked down upon the mortal world. They watched the world in silence. Some chuckled, while others plotted. Many of them had let the name of Odysseus fade from memory. Ages had passed since the fires of Troy died out, and ships were shattered on distant coastlines. Years had gone by since men who once stood tall among heroes had turned to salt and silence beneath the ocean waves. However, gods do not age like humans, and they eventually grow bored. In their domain, boredom was a dangerous thing. It meant they turned their gaze downward once more, remembering their old amusements. They began to speak names that hadn't been uttered in an age. When the name of Odysseus surfaced among them again, it did not go unnoticed. Athena had never forgotten him. The gray-eyed goddess born of wisdom and war had quietly tracked him as he wandered from one island to the next, bleeding, burning, and losing fragments of the man he used to be. She had begged for his safety many times, but Zeus, the father of gods and master of storms, had hesitated. He called this inaction balance. He called it justice. He claimed he was honoring the rage of Poseidon, for the sea god still refused to forgive the mortal who blinded his son and mocked him while escaping the Cyclops' cliffs. But now Athena took a stand in the grand hall, gripping her spear, her voice low and cutting. She spoke of Ithaca, of a queen waiting in the shadows, and a son entering manhood without his father. She described a mortal man who had been broken and beaten but had never surrendered. She insisted that the time had come. Zeus, who had once crushed mountains and incinerated cities for far less, finally nodded. Maybe he was moved. Maybe he was exhausted. Or perhaps he simply missed the sound of his own authority. He turned to Hermes, the swift-footed messenger, and issued a command that would ripple from Olympus to shake the mortal world. "Go to Ogygia," Zeus ordered. "Find the nymph. Tell Calypso she must release the mortal she is keeping. Not tomorrow, not in the future, but now. This order is absolute. The time is here." Hermes, wearing sandals of flight and a robe spun from the light of dawn, followed the command immediately. He dove from the heights of Olympus, crossing the globe in a single heartbeat. He descended through clouds as thick as wool, cutting through wind, rain, and sudden stillness until the island of Ogygia appeared beneath him like a green gem set in silver waters. He touched down in the orchard surrounding her cave, where the trees bore fruit in every season and the atmosphere remained eternal. Calypso had seen him approaching. She was ready. She met him at the entrance, her face composed and her eyes as dark as the deep ocean. Following custom, she offered him food and wine that tasted of memories, but Hermes refused to sit or drink. Instead, he unfurled a gold-bound scroll and read aloud the words carved by thunder. She must let the mortal go. He must build a raft. She must assist him. She must say goodbye. The cave seemed to grow colder as he spoke. The light faded. Calypso stood completely motionless. She asked no questions and shed no tears, though her jaw clenched and her hands formed fists at her sides. When Hermes departed, she didn't watch him leave. Instead, she turned toward the sea and stood there for a long time, listening to the waves as if they might provide a reason for her grief. They offered nothing. The gods had spoken, and the game would continue. When she walked back into the cave, Odysseus was waiting. He had spotted the winged god and felt the atmosphere shift. He asked her nothing. She answered with silence. Eventually, she slowly explained what had to be done. She promised him tools. She promised him timber. She would give him a cloak to protect against the spray and a wind to speed his journey. However, she would not give him a blessing. This was not because she didn't love him, but precisely because she did. He thanked her and she smiled in a way that made him avert his gaze. He worked for days, felling trees and shaping the wood. He bound the logs with rope and sealed them with pitch. She assisted him, never mentioning what would happen next. The raft took form and the skies remained calm. On the morning of his departure, she handed him a satchel of bread, a skin of water, and a cloak woven from moonlight. She kissed him one time, not gently, not desperately, just once, and then he was gone. She remained on the shore long after the ocean had swallowed the last glimpse of his sail. Alone once more, still immortal, a prisoner in paradise, she was left to walk the same soft trails and sleep under the same silent stars, waiting for the tides to deliver another broken soul to her doorstep. The raft drifted slowly across the open water. It was a fragile skeleton of wood, bound together by sheer desperation and hope. It creaked with every wave, the ropes groaning like old men in their sleep. Yet it held together, it floated, and for a while the sea was merciful, not generous or warm, but kind enough to spare him a violent death. The breeze sent by Calypso's whispered breath filled the square cloth he used as a sail, pushing him steadily westward. He sailed onward toward the memory of home. Odysseus stood tall, though his hands were raw from the ropes and his eyes were faded by the glare of the sun. There was nowhere to hide from the elements. He had only the open sky, the salt spray, and a thirst that water could never fully satisfy. He ate his bread in small rations, drank his water quietly, and slept under the open stars, frequently jolted awake by a sharp pang of dread in his chest. It wasn't the ocean's surface that terrified him, but rather the monsters that lurked beneath it. For Poseidon had come back. During the days Odysseus had spent drifting, the god of the sea had been traveling far away. He had been enjoying feasts with the Ethiopians, causing storms in distant oceans, and turning a deaf ear to Athena's requests and Zeus's orders. But the moment he returned and spotted the mortal hero, the same clever man from Ithaca who had blinded his son Polyphemus, gliding across his waters again, a fury erupted in him that seemed to crack the heavens. He surged up from the abyss in a chariot made of sea foam, seaweed hanging from his beard and his eyes as dark as the fate of every sailor who ever drowned pleading for help. He didn't scream or shout. Instead, he just lifted his trident and summoned the ocean. The water responded immediately. A wind struck Odysseus first, snapping at him like a dog turning on its owner. Next, a sudden squall ripped the sail right off the raft and tossed it skyward like a rag. The waves seemed to grow teeth, rising up like massive walls. Water crashed down relentlessly, submerging the raft and spinning it around like a dry leaf in a gale. The wood splintered and the ropes burst apart. It wasn't a boat anymore, it was just driftwood, and Odysseus was drifting with it. Poseidon observed from a distance, completely uncaring, for a god cannot be denied his revenge. Odysseus held onto whatever he could grab. A lone wooden beam, slippery with salt water and blood, was the only thing keeping him above the surface. The ocean attempted to pull him down, grabbing at his legs and filling his mouth with salty silence. He drifted for 2 days and nights, a tiny dot in a watery universe, observed by seabirds and deities alike. His vision went fuzzy and his arms lost all feeling. He didn't offer songs or try to make deals, he just survived. His story could have finished right there if someone hadn't taken pity on him. A woman emerged from the water, made not of skin and bone, but of foam, wind, and shimmering scales. This was Leucothea, the white goddess, who was once human but had become something strange and divine. Seeing him shattered and dying, she felt compassion. She appeared next to him holding a veil woven from sea silk and memories, promising it would keep him safe. She told him to throw away his heavy cloak, his pride, and the remains of his raft, and to trust only her gift. He paused for a second, but she vanished before he could say no. All that was left was the veil and the echo of her words. So he let go. Odysseus wrapped the veil around his chest and threw himself into the waves. The ocean tried to swallow him, but he resurfaced. He tried to quiet his breathing, holding onto life with the tenacity of ancient rulers and fading stars. He floated for days, his body stripped of power and his mind fraying at the edges of madness. Eventually, the ocean lost interest. Whether Poseidon felt satisfied or just got distracted, he allowed the winds to fade. The currents shifted, revealing the coastline of Scheria. He saw green hills stretching behind white sands, tall cliffs guarding the shore like sentinels, bending trees, and finally heard birds singing, breaking the long silence he had endured across the world. He dragged himself onto the beach, looking like someone born anew from the sea's womb. He dug his fingers into the wet sand to make sure it was real and kissed the ground, not like a returning traveler, but like a ghost touching life again. He was solitary, yet he had made it through once more. Sand stuck to him like a new layer of skin, and his limbs barely responded to his commands. He had washed up with absolutely nothing, lacking even the energy to cry. He lay for a time right where the water meets the earth, where waves reached out to pull him back but retreated just in time. The tide spared him. The gods had taken their fill and were quiet for the moment. When the sun rose, it illuminated the coast of Scheria. The land revealed itself as green, expansive, and inviting, a place forgotten by anger and untouched by war. Moving with the caution of someone used to betrayal, Odysseus dragged himself up the incline. He crept into the protection of the forest, discovered a pile of leaves under 2 olive trees that leaned against each other like longtime companions, and finally surrendered to a deep, dreamless sleep. It wasn't a deity who discovered him there, but a girl. Nausicaa, the daughter of King Alcinous and Queen Arete, had gone to the riverbank with her maids to clean clothes and laugh under the morning sun. She was youthful and confident, her skin glowing and golden. Her voice carried a musical quality found only in those who have never had a reason to dread the future. When the girl's laughter echoed through the valley, it roused Odysseus, and he emerged from the underbrush like a wild beast breaking free from a net. There he stood, streaked with sea salt and half-naked, his beard a tangled mess and his gaze frantic. While the other girls shrieked and scattered in every direction, the princess stood firm. She did not flee. Her breath might have caught in her throat, but her feet remained rooted to the earth. He possessed an aura that seemed to make the gods themselves lean in to listen. She didn't see a wreck. She saw the silhouette of ancient strength, a man who had survived the impossible and was ready to do so again. Odysseus chose his words with extreme care, weaving his sentences like a tapestry he hadn't worked on in years. He asked for assistance, not with a demand, but with deep humility. He praised her beauty, utilizing the eloquent tongue of a monarch who understood how to balance flattery with honesty. She heard him out, and despite not knowing his name or his history, she extended kindness. She provided him with clothes from her cart, oil to clean himself, and food to quell the burning hunger in his stomach. However, she instructed him to head to her father's palace separately. "To the gates alone," she instructed, "and humble yourself at my mother's feet. If you gain her favor, you gain us all." It was the queen, she explained, not the king, who truly held sway in the court of the Phaeacians. So he waited and then trailed behind, now clad in fresh linen and dignity, even if his feet were still bloody. The city loomed ahead of him like a vision from a dream, sculpted in marble and copper, featuring towers that sparkled in the daylight and walls as smooth as polished ivory. Thanks to Athena, he slipped through the gates unseen, wrapped in a mist that shielded him from the prying eyes of the locals. Upon reaching the great hall, he located the queen on her throne and fell to his knees just as Nausicaa had suggested. The queen observed him with eyes sharpened by leadership yet softened by the years. She recognized the exhaustion etched into his skin and the pain in his voice, and she chose to listen. Initially, Odysseus kept his identity a secret. He spun a tale of disastrous weather and foreign shores, speaking of deities who blessed and cursed, and of a man who desired his homeland more than any luxury. The royal couple provided him with a feast, and as he dined, the veil of anonymity began to lift. The court buzzed with whispers. He moved with the grace of a prince, and his speech carried the heavy resonance of command and tragedy. This was no common drifter or castaway. This was a man of destiny, a guest sent by fate. King Alcinous, a ruler of peace and ships, rose to speak. He asked plainly if this stranger wanted to go home. The Phaeacians, masters of sailing and swift vessels, would guarantee his passage. A crew would be summoned and a ship launched. But before that, they asked to hear his full story. Who was he? Where had he wandered? What had he witnessed? With the firelight dancing across his features and the murmurs of the court fading into silence, Odysseus finally dropped the mask. He spoke the name that had toppled Troy. It was a name the gods had chased, a name that still carried the metallic scent of blood and the sting of brine. "I am Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca," he declared, "and this is the tale of my return." A hush fell over the hall of Alcinous as the name Odysseus hung in the air. It was a legend that had lived on the tongues of poets and travelers, whispered in distant markets and carried across the seas by rumor. Some spoke it with worship, others with terror, and some with skepticism, wondering if the man had become more myth than flesh. Yet there he stood, illuminated by the hearth, his eyes lined with salt and time, his hands, once used to gripping spears, now curled around a wine cup. The audience leaned in, not just with curiosity, but with the respect reserved for an ancient epic being sung by the very man who lived it. Odysseus took a deep breath. He didn't look at the king or queen, nor at the servants standing frozen like statues, nor even at Nausicaa, who sat quietly in the shadows. His gaze pierced through the smoke of the fire, past the painted rafters, and into the darkness, back to stars drifting over oceans he had crossed too often. In his mind, he saw the walls of Troy once more, the shattered gates and the fires rising like a final curse. He saw the Trojan horse, dark and silent under the moonlight, a gift that was never truly a gift. It was a victory born not of luck, but of his own cunning. And so he began his narrative. He described the city of Troy, speaking not with arrogance, but with deep fatigue. He recounted the 10-year siege, the sorrow that weighed them down despite their triumph, and the men who aged in battle gear only to die without ever seeing their families again. He explained how the gods fought both alongside and against them, their favor shifting like sand in a breeze, unable to agree on who should be tormented and who should be saved. When the towers finally collapsed and the citizens screamed amidst the flames, it should have marked the end. Yet for Odysseus, that was merely the beginning. Once the last word hung in the air, the great hall fell still. The only sounds were the crackling fire and sputtering torches on the walls. Neither the king nor the queen spoke. It wasn't a silence of confusion, but the heavy quiet that arrives when ancient history is laid bare, pressing gently on the souls of everyone present. The Phaeacians were experts of the sea and clever craftsmanship, yet few among them had ever heard a saga quite like this. None had ever looked into the eyes of a survivor who lived through it all and returned with the voice to share the whole truth. King Alcinous, broad-shouldered and regal, eventually stood up. He viewed Odysseus not with judgment, but with a look bordering on reverence. He spoke only of honor, skipping any warnings or demands for repayment. He proclaimed that a man who had endured such agony shouldn't have to wait another single day to return home. He summoned his captains and best craftsmen to prepare the fleet's finest ship immediately. Provisions were loaded, and a crew selected so Odysseus could sail before sunrise. He wouldn't need to lift an oar or touch a rope. He would simply rest while others worked. It was a gift, but also an acknowledgement that a stranger once known becomes sacred under their laws. That evening, a final banquet was held. Musicians played on lyres carved from golden wood, and the bard Demodocus returned to sing of Troy. He sang of heroes like Achilles and Hector, and of the fires and tears that followed the war. Yet he didn't name Odysseus in the verses. He didn't have to. The man was right there, pale and quiet in the flickering light, a legend who had stepped out of the myth to sit among them. Queen Arete placed gifts in his hands, a silver-threaded cloak and a bronze chest filled with treasures shining like starlight. She kissed his forehead like a mother and whispered words meant only for him. Nausicaa remained quiet, though her eyes carried the weight of a farewell she didn't dare speak. She met his gaze just once, receiving a faint, sad, yet grateful smile in return. By dawn, the harbor was peaceful. The ship was ready, its hull curved like a swan's neck, sails furled but eager. Odysseus walked slowly toward the vessel, his limbs stiff but his heart bracing for a feeling he hadn't dared to hold for years: hope. The sailors helped him aboard with firm hands and silent nods, requiring no ceremony. Wrapped in Arete's cloak, he sat at the stern, staring at the open sea. He remained silent, offering no final speeches or promises. The anchor lifted, the wind caught the sail, and the ship slipped from the harbor like a dream fading into the morning. The sea remained calm, and for the first time in ages the gods kept their silence. As the sun climbed higher, Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, finally allowed his eyes to close. He did not sleep like a fugitive chased by beasts and deities, but like a man who had truly earned his rest. The crew rowed without speaking, and the vessel cut through the water as fast as a thought. With every breath of wind, the homeland he had lost and found only in his dreams drew closer. The journey wasn't fully over, but the hardest trials were finally behind him. After years of circling the globe, his destination lay just ahead, waiting under a pale sky and the rustle of olive leaves. The boat sliced through the waves like a sharp blade through fabric, moving quietly and consistently. It was not driven by the sweat of men, but by the will of gods who were finally tired of his suffering. Under a sky that looked like polished stone, the ocean was flat. Odysseus remained asleep at the back of the ship, hands folded on his chest, his head resting on the cloak Queen Arete had given him. He didn't move. His breathing was deep and slow, the slumber of a survivor who had endured fire and ice, who had cried in secret and screamed without making a sound. He had lost more than he could calculate and was afraid to see what was left. No nightmares plagued him. His mind, usually filled with storms and monsters, was finally still. There were no voices, just the peace of darkness. The Phaeacian sailors remained silent as they rowed. They had seen enough to know when a mission was holy. Their passenger wasn't just a traveler, He was a vessel of something ancient, a legend brought back to life. When the green peaks of Ithaca finally broke the horizon, rising from the water, no one cheered. They simply lowered their oars and let the current pull them in. The harbor was empty, as if the island itself was holding its breath. Cliffs stared down silently, the trees were still, and even the seagulls made no sound. It felt less like the return of a man and more like the return of a shadow. They beached the ship in the dim light of twilight. Odysseus slept through the slowing tides and shifting winds. The sailors carried him off the boat gently, treating him like a sleeping child or a fallen monarch. They laid him on the sand with his chest of treasures beside him, leaving him wrapped in his cloak. Then, their job done and oaths kept, they returned to their ship and departed. None of them stayed to witness the divine punishment that was coming. Poseidon had not forgotten. The god of the sea had been watching the entire time. When the ship that carried Odysseus reached open water again, gliding proudly like a swan, he attacked. With a single glance he turned the vessel to stone. First the prow froze, then the deck, and finally the sail, all hardening into gray rock. The crew froze in mid-motion, becoming statues of salt and sorrow, trapped forever in their final act of kindness. The stone ship sank beneath the waves, not as debris, but as a monument. It was a permanent reminder that showing kindness to the son of Laertes came with a heavy price. Odysseus knew nothing of this tragedy. He woke up alone on the shore of his homeland. The scent of the soil and the hum of cicadas felt both familiar and alien. Stiff from the stillness, he sat up and looked around. Olive trees swayed in the breeze and the quiet green hills rose behind him. A shepherd's path, overgrown with weeds and thyme, wound down to the water. This was Ithaca, yet it wasn't the exact place he remembered. Time had eroded the rocks and thickened the vines, but the land remained. It had waited for him. However, he couldn't simply stand up and walk into his palace. He wasn't a king right now. He was a stranger on his own soil, a ghost among the living. His home wasn't his anymore. Arrogant suitors were feasting in his halls, fat on his wine, wooing his wife and mocking his name. His son had grown up without a father's guidance. His servants had lived without a master. His queen, faithful or not, held court alone. If he returned looking ragged and unknown, they wouldn't bow, they would laugh. So wrapping his cloak tighter, he hiked into the hills, hiding his gifts in a cave under the watchful eyes of the gods. Amidst the wild goats and wind-blown rocks, he encountered a man tending sheep. The figure was weathered by age and hard labor, but still strong. When the man spoke, it was with the voice of someone who had once called Odysseus master. It was Eumaeus, the swineherd. Odysseus did not reveal his identity. Not yet. He observed and listened, feeling the weight of the years in every word spoken. In the small hut where Eumaeus lived, with smoke drifting through the thatch and the smell of stew in the air, Odysseus sat and ate quietly. It was a modest place, but it felt more like home than any palace had in years. The king was back, but the reckoning was just beginning. The hut was low and worn, patched with branches and clay, its roof sagging under the weight of many winters. Smoke seeped from a hole in the ceiling, stinging the eyes but warming the bones. Inside, the world shrank down to firelight and the sound of wooden bowls. Eumaeus, the old swineherd, moved with the weary grace of a man who knew both servitude and pride, who had stuck to his duty even when time forgot to reward him. He talked often, not to brag or complain, but with the slow cadence of someone who had been alone with silence for too long. He spoke of Ithaca, of the suitors who infested the palace like rats in a granary, eating while the queen waited and the people whispered. He spoke of Penelope, and how she held onto her loom and her grief with the same stubbornness, weaving by day and unraveling by night, keeping her vows with nothing but thread. He spoke of Telemachus, who had left to find news of his father, full of fire but walking into the world like a lamb among wolves. Odysseus listened to it all. He kept his name hidden behind his teeth like a blade concealed under a cloak. He nodded and asked questions like a beggar curious about royal gossip. But the more he heard, the more a slow fury built in his chest. It wasn't the wild rage of the battlefield or the panic of a shipwreck, but the cold, patient wrath of a man who had endured too much to die quietly. His house had become a stranger's hall. His people lived under the shadow of thieves. His son, untested and outnumbered, was wandering kingdoms looking for a ghost. And yet here, in this smoke-filled hut, loyalty survived. Eumaeus hadn't bent the knee to the intruders. He guarded the flocks, honored his king's memory, and waited. That night, as the wind howled through the olive trees and the fire burned low, Odysseus spoke to the gods. He didn't pray loudly but whispered in the quiet between breaths. He named them: Athena, who had shadowed him on every broken shore; Zeus, whose thunder had both cursed and saved him; Poseidon, whose hatred had defined his journey. He named them not to beg, but simply to be heard. If they were still watching, they would see him now. He wasn't the weeping castaway on Calypso's beach or the broken sailor on a raft. He was the wolf who had returned to his den and found it overrun. In the days that followed, Telemachus returned. Athena herself guided him home through seas that had once tried to kill him, bringing him to Eumaeus's hut as the sun set behind the hills. Father and son stood beneath the olive trees, one weighed down by years, the other burning with the restless fire of youth, still untempered by blood. They didn't know each other, not truly. The boy had been a child when the ships left for Troy, and the man had become a myth, whispered in longing and half-remembered songs. But when their eyes met, and words were exchanged, the truth rose like a flame buried under ash. Odysseus revealed himself. He didn't make a grand speech or shed tears. He simply dropped his disguise, his voice steady and low, his face shadowed but proud. Telemachus stared, stunned by the gravity of the man standing before him. He didn't embrace his father immediately. He asked questions. He measured the man by his answers. And when the truth finally settled in his bones, when the doubt fell away like a shattered scab, he fell into his father's arms. For a brief moment, the years that had torn them apart seemed to vanish. Plans began to form. The suitors still sat fat and careless in the palace halls, believing their rule was unchallenged. They didn't know the king had returned. They didn't know the son had become a man. They didn't know that the gods, silent for so long, were watching closely again. Odysseus wouldn't return to his home with trumpets or banners. He would return like a storm creeping over calm waters. He would wear the face of a beggar and carry no sword. He would walk through the doors of his own house as a shadow, a whisper, a reckoning long denied. And when the moment came for the truth to be revealed and names to be reclaimed, it would not be done with mercy. It would be done with the quiet, final justice of a king who had come home. The palace itself appeared weary, with vines slowly encroaching on the outer walls. The massive doors, etched with legends of gods and monsters, had ceased to protect the honor they once guarded. Inside, the halls were filled not with a royal family's joy, but with the racket of strangers eating. The suitors had claimed the place, growing arrogant while the true master was away. They sprawled on furniture meant for better men, spilling wine on the rugs and barking orders at servants who used to work with pride. They even mocked the name of Odysseus, treating him like nothing more than a frightening tale for children. The queen's weaving room had turned into a center for strategy and whispers. Telemachus was under surveillance, though nobody actually feared the boy. As for Penelope, she drifted through the halls like a ghost in silk, possessing a gaze full of grief but a backbone made of steel. The intruders were convinced the king was gone forever, taken by the gods or the sea. So they drank and plotted, expecting the queen to eventually choose a new husband, surrendering both her body and her throne in the same breath. They were completely oblivious to the approaching storm. Odysseus entered disguised as a beggar. He was hunched over, covered in soot and unshaven. Years of shouting over the wind had even roughened his voice. Nobody realized who he was or offered a bow. Instead, they pushed him around and threw food scraps and insults his way, treating him like a street dog sniffing around their dinner. But the king was observing everything. He memorized their faces, calculated the range between them, and tallied their weapons. He noted who jeered and who remained quiet, sizing up his foes with the calm discipline of a hunter lining up a final kill. Telemachus played his part perfectly. The son who had traveled the globe looking for his father now sat right next to him without saying a word. He kept the secret hidden behind his eyes, revealing nothing through his tone or behavior. He waited alongside Odysseus, and it felt like even the gods were holding their breath. Penelope kept her distance, watching the beggar with suspicion. Her heart raced oddly. She recognized something familiar in how he stood and his silence, yet she was afraid to ask. She had learned that hope could be cruel, so she didn't trust the feeling. Finally, the time came for the test. Penelope produced the great bow of Odysseus, polished horn strung with giant sinew. The suitors tried to string it, but every single one failed. Their arms shook and their egos shattered, forcing them to laugh off their humiliation. Then the beggar stepped up. The room erupted in insults and curses, but Penelope quietly gave her permission. Telemachus cleared the area and Odysseus grabbed the weapon. He didn't struggle, he strung the bow using muscle memory. His hands remembered the curves and the string hummed a familiar tune. He loaded an arrow, aimed, and let it fly. The shot sliced through the air like a knife and slammed into the target, instantly silencing the entire room. Then he spoke. His voice rang out, clear and steady, the disguise gone. He announced his true identity, reclaimed his home, and listed the suitors' offenses one by one. And before the echo could die away, he fired again. The first victim dropped with an arrow buried in his throat. Panic exploded in the room, but there was no escape because the doors were locked tight. The suitors scrambled to grab their swords, only to find that Telemachus had already hidden them away. Odysseus fought with the intensity of the war god, unleashing shot after shot. Every single arrow was a verdict delivered. Telemachus stood right by his side. The swineherd Eumaeus and the cowherd Philodeus joined the fight as well. Every one of them was faithful, silent, and fierce. Blood coated the stone floor. Screams of terror bounced off the marble walls. Men who had spent years mocking Odysseus's name were now screaming it, begging for mercy. He offered absolutely none, not after the lost years. Not after the house was disgraced. Not after the throne was robbed and his queen's heart left wounded for so long. This wasn't just revenge. It was balance, a reckoning that was long overdue. When the last body hit the floor, when silence came back and the torches flickered quietly again, Odysseus stood alone in the center of the great hall. The bow dangled in his hand, his eyes burning with the cold intensity of a man who had waited far too long for justice. Surrounding him, the sons of noble families lay destroyed. Tables were flipped over. The house reeked of ash and blood. Yet he did not cry. The slaughter was over. The suitors' bodies were scattered across the stone floor like deer hunted down in a sacred forest. Their wine-stained cloaks were stiff with gore, their open mouths finally quiet. The hearth fire still burned. It was the same fire that once warmed royal banquets, but now it glowed over the wreckage of betrayal and justice. Odysseus stood in the calm, his chest heaving, the bow still gripped tight. He hadn't spoken a word since the last arrow flew. The screams had stopped. The noise of panic was gone, leaving only the soft sounds of Eumaeus collecting weapons from the dead to break the stillness. Telemachus, splattered with the blood of men who had stolen his childhood, stood next to his father, his shoulders back, his eyes no longer those of a boy. And still, even now, Odysseus wasn't complete. Penelope stayed away, somewhere else in the palace. She waited, her loom forgotten. Her mind battled between hope and doubt. Trembling servants had brought her the news, but she didn't rush to the hall. She didn't faint from joy. She stayed in the shadows, quiet as the walls themselves, twisting her veil in her hands. For 20 years she had dreamed of his return. Now a stranger in rags claimed to be the husband she had buried in her mind ages ago. Hope had tricked her before. She wouldn't let it fool her again. Odysseus washed the blood from his hands and threw off his beggar's clothes. Athena appeared then, invisible to mortal eyes, and touched his shoulder. His posture straightened, his skin glowed with youth, and his beard turned dark again. The exhaustion of 10 years at sea fell off him like a heavy cloak. When he stood in the queen's room, he looked just as he did before leaving for Troy, proud and tall, with that same hard jawline and the same storm in his eyes. But Penelope didn't smile. She analyzed him like a sculptor examines a raw slab of stone, searching for the form concealed inside. She didn't run to hold him right away. Instead, she quizzed him and weighed his every phrase. That quiet reserve wasn't because she was cold. It was a shield crafted from years of doubt. She had kept the realm intact through sheer determination and strategy, outsmarting deceivers and shutting down the spineless. She raised a boy on her own while keeping her self-respect as sharp as a knife. She wasn't about to collapse into a stranger's embrace just because he said the right name. So she put him to the test. She commanded the maids to take the wedding bed she and Odysseus once shared and set it up outside the bedroom. It seemed like an easy task, but it was a trap no fake could survive. Odysseus froze at the mention of the bed. He spoke instantly, his tone heavy with the past, insisting that the bed couldn't be shifted. He explained how he had crafted it himself from a living olive trunk rooted deep in the soil, building the very room around it. He had cemented their life into that wood and stone. Moving it meant someone had cut the tree and severed their bond. Hearing this, Penelope broke down. She rushed across the floor and held him, not as a queen welcoming a monarch, but as a wife taking back her partner. The distance between them crumbled like brittle leaves. They stood there, not as ghosts or strangers, but as the couple who started their story with a single look and ended a war with a single truth. That night they went back to the olive bed. They didn't say much, as there were simply too many tales and old wounds to discuss. They just lay together, the silence between them feeling complete rather than empty. They had lost time, friends, and almost each other, but they had survived. The gods had challenged them, the ocean had separated them, and time had tried to fade them away. Yet in the end they made it back to where it all began. And as Ithaca slumbered under moonlight that turned the patient hills and olive trees silver, the king and queen were finally one again.